Jasmine, truly appreciate your time and presence. I've been a huge fan of what you've been building with Monarch, so I'm excited to hear more. But before we dive into the details, I would love to hear like what started this interest and spark for you in sports investing. Like, where did that all begin for you, and what kind of wanted helped you want to get your foot into the space?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I kind of fell into the sports investing space a little bit by accident. I was on the operating side of sports, working in a role with 49ers, and we had just opened Levi Stadium, and the ownership group was starting to think about like what are the things beyond just the football team and the venue that they could get involved with. And so really started thinking more holistically about their investment portfolio and because it was sort of the first foray into it, they didn't really have a whole team around supporting the investment operation yet. So they said, "Hey, Jasmine, do you want to come help look at this with us?" And so I kind of got pulled into it and learned it as I went. So it was very happenstance, but then have really spent the bulk of my entire career now in the sports investing space. But ultimately, I'm really looking at investments across the sports investment ecosystem, but started to feel a couple of years ago like the best investment opportunity I was seeing in sports was just like felt like it was really clearly in women's sports. And yet I felt like looking around, there just weren't a lot of people investing capital in women's sports. There were, new sports funds popping up every day, but none that were focused on the women's sports space. And it felt like bringing capital to that ecosystem was going to be really important to help realize a lot of the growth that was beginning and that I felt sort of could clearly continue to evolve. And so that really led me to founding Monarch.
You work with Causeway, you work with 49ers, like really big brands and organizations in sports. What skills or lessons did you take away from these previous work environments that you carry over into Monarch and what you all do daily now?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'd say in particular, the 6 years that I spent at Causeway, the three founders there all had been in the investing space for, 20, 30 years in fields outside of sports before even launching Causeway. And so they were just incredible mentors and people to learn the business of investing from, but then also I think each brought their own unique perspective around the sports industry and sort of expertise to that. And so, yeah, I think incredible people to learn just like, how to think about investing as someone who wasn't sort of classically trained in this space originally. But then I think also, looking at a lot of the businesses that we did at Causeway, I think they really touched a lot of the big themes that continue to drive a lot of the growth in sports today. So everything from sort of the media and content space to the consumer product space to VIP and experiential, like all of these things that I think are such themes that are driving the growth of sports and women's sports. And so I feel like looking at a lot of those investments and collaborating with a lot of our portfolio companies there definitely like help to frame the way I think about the way the sports industry is today and the way it can continue to evolve. And then I think more and more like the work that we do at Monarch really calls back to my like operating days at the 49ers and really thinking about, how do you build and develop a venue? How do you like think creatively about the way to activate partnerships or the fan experience or commerce. So all of these things I think really feed into what I do at Monarch. And so it's fun to get to pull from all of those areas as we think about building a lot of these teams in partnership with our investments here.
hmm Well, you talked about how when you all were starting, there weren't a lot of people deploying capital into the women's sports space. When you were looking to raise from LPs, what were some of the challenges that you faced educating other investors on why this is a good opportunity?
Yeah, it was interesting when we were going out and talking to LPs, like, Kara, my co-founder, and I always talk about like we feel like we raised the fund at Monarch probably like right on the bleeding edge of when you could convince serious investors that there was enough proof points and enough traction to invest really meaningful capital into the women's sports space. And I would say, even thinking back to like January of 2023, when we first started capital raise, the way that the women's sports space has accelerated from then to now is kind of crazy to think. I remember when we were first starting the fundraise, we talked to people a lot about women's soccer and women's basketball as sort of the two themes that we really felt excited about. And I think because you had some of the proof points around Angel City and the Washington Spirit and a couple of things in the NWSL, I think, people bought the trajectory of women's soccer. But, back in January of 2023, people were asking us things like, do people actually want to watch like women's basketball? Is this going to become a mainstream thing? And then fast forward to that March, and you had March Madness with the women's tournament surpassing viewership from the men's tournament. And I think you've seen this sort of incredible acceleration in women's basketball from that time. And so even thinking of when we started the fundraise in January to the end of March, and sort of how we stopped getting the question, are people interested in women's
Yeah.
basketball? That became clear. So yeah, I think it definitely took time to help people to understand the industry, but there was also this dynamic of like, every week and month there were sort of new growth records and new high water marks being set. And so we could also sort of tell those stories along the way. And I think that really helped to get to our sort of oversubscribed fund and be off and running.
Yeah, and speaking about that, you recently announced a few months ago that the fund size is now up to 250 million, I believe, from which you all initially had, kind of wanted at 100 million. So what changes in when you scale to a fund size like that in terms of like team structure, the deals you're looking for, risk tolerance, et cetera?
Yeah. Yeah. When Karen and I started the fund, we talked a lot about what was the right amount of capital to raise. And quite frankly, we were just like, we think this market is going to grow really quickly, but we can't know exactly for sure how quick. And we don't want to raise more capital than we can very easily deploy. And so we said, let's raise $100 million. But I think very clearly since then, the market has continued to really accelerate in growth. And so, yeah, earlier this year when we started thinking about, what really is the right fund size for where the market is today. We felt like at that point we had $150 million fund, and we were like, if we had 250, that would really be sized a little bit better to both the investments that we'd already made in our portfolio, where we were seeing sort of high ROI opportunities to put more capital to work, but also with the other opportunities that we were continuing to see evolve in the market of our next few investments, which we'll be announcing here soon. And so, yeah, I think we ultimately felt like, we've always wanted to approach this fund as sort of a concentrated set of investments. So think of it as, 6 to 8 investments in total, not trying to do 100 different things, but do a handful of things that we think can be some of the top performing properties in women's sports. And so I think that theme is still the same. We'll still make the same number of investments, but it's much more being able to go deeper and put more capital to work in those opportunities, and making sure that we have capital to continue to support new opportunities for monetization and growth, whether that's in the facility space, in continuing to build out high quality management teams and building those even deeper to go after sort of the audience demand around monetization. Yeah, I think it's just really demonstrates, some of the continued proof points we see around growth in women's sports.
Right. And you all have done deals mainly around the NWSL, at least publicly. Can you kind of talk about some of those undervalued or opportunities within women's sports that people aren't really looking at? Maybe some of the niche sports that you all think have some upside?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think for us, because we'll only make sort of 8 investments out of this fund, I would say we probably spend a little bit less time on things that are super long tail, not because we don't think those are exciting investments, but just because we have such a concentrated strategy, we do look for opportunities that we feel like are lower risk, but because of where women's sports is today, still have this sort of incredible like venture like returns potential. And so that's really what's a sweet spot for us. And I'd say lately, I think, you mentioned we have investments in three NWSL teams in Boston, LA, and San Diego. I think we've been spending a lot of time thinking about what are the opportunities in global football really outside of the US. And so, I think a lot of exciting things happening in the UK or in Europe more broadly, new leagues launching like the NSL in Canada. And so you're seeing lots of interesting opportunities. And with football being such a global sport, global talent pool, global brand demand, global fan demand, we're really excited about some of the things that are happening in football outside of the US, including in some markets where you really haven't seen any transactions yet in around women's teams, but where we feel like there's huge potential.
Hmm.
Um, and then I'd say the other thing that gets us excited, beyond some of the big themes like the NWSL or the WNBA, are really thinking about what are the sets of rights in women's sports that are really interesting, maybe in some cases, sort of well known major revenue streams in men's sports, and maybe in other cases, sort of spaces that we feel like are unique monetization opportunities for women's sports, but really thinking about those rights and where are there gaps around the way those rights can actually be commercialized and brought to market and really drive value for rights holders, and thinking about where can we get creative about helping to move the ecosystem forward around those. So, that could be anything like video gaming rights, commerce rights, media rights, just like where does sort of taking a slightly different approach to commercializing those rights actually yield a much better experience for the women's sports fan and also yield a better commercial outcome for rights holders. And so that's an area where we're spending some time around, are there businesses to be incubated or partnerships to be built to really help to bring that all to life, to help to move the entire women's sports ecosystem forward.
Hmm, for sure. What does value add mean for you all outside of capital? Obviously, you have an operator background and experience in that capacity. Is that something that you all like to kind of be involved in after you deploy the capital within an asset, like getting your hands dirty, being in the trenches, and working alongside the companies that you invest in or organizations?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd say in particular when we think about sort of the commercial half of these businesses, me, Kara, and the team that we sort of continue to build out around us all come from operating backgrounds, and so all have sort of deep expertise in certain areas for how to help drive growth, whether it's, the work that Kara has done in founding and launching Angel City and what that initial build looks like and how that's applicable to future expansion franchises, to the way we think about, venue development, calling back to my days around the development of Levi Stadium. And, now how do we bring other venues to life that are purpose built for professional women's teams? And so we love to dive in around those specific areas where we have a lot of expertise and knowledge, but then also really use our networks because we kind of sit at this fun place of like the center of women's sports and really like talking to a lot of like brands or operators or others that want to spend more time in this space. We can often just be great connectors into other experts in the ecosystem who are particularly passionate about women's sports and excellent at what they do. And so really delivering that value add from our team, but also our broader network, has been really fun. And I think that's like what makes teams or leagues or other rights holders excited to partner with us is kind of like that incremental partnership that you get beyond just the capital invested.
Hmm. How important is technology and innovation when it comes to the opportunities that you all are looking in? And what impact do you think, AI, first party fan data, virtual experience, like all these different technologies that are emerging now, what impact they will have on the future of women's sports?
Yeah. I mean, I think when I think about technology and innovation, I mean, I kind of think about innovation first, or just like, you know, what are the ways we should be doing things differently in the women's sports space than maybe they've been done traditionally in sports in the past? And no question, there's tons of best practices that women's sports teams get to really benefit from just from this ecosystem. having matured over the last handful of decades in the men's sports space that we can call into. But I think there's a real opportunity, since you're serving a very different sports fan in women's sports than men's sports, to think about how you want to bring that fan experience to life. So women's sports fans are, younger, I think like average age in your early 30s versus in, late 50s or 60s in men's sports. A lot more racially diverse. You see a lot more socioeconomic diversity as well in the fan bases. And so thinking about like how are we actually like building different types of experiences and not just copying the way things have been done in the past. And so like how does innovation play into that? I think is a topic that we're always debating, and making sure we're not just like holding on to biases of, oh, this is how you put together a sponsorship package, and instead saying like, how do we actually show up in a different way or challenge our assumptions? Um, and so I think some of that is served through technology, and thinking about, I think in particular, like the channels where you're reaching some of those sports fans, really leaning a lot less heavily on legacy media, and thinking about how you're sort of getting into digital and more real-time content development, through to how are you delivering a more like seamless consumer experience where, I think because you're speaking to a younger fan base, you can actually probably push the envelope more in terms of the types of technology you can integrate into venues or into the end fan experience, because you have a consumer base that's excited to try those new things and different things, and that's really the core of your fan base versus what you might see in the MLB or other leagues. And so I think that's exciting. I do think that like when we think about where does capital go for investment into women's sports, no question, some of it is technology, but oftentimes a lot of these teams or leagues are really, really under resourced just from a human capital perspective. And so we always start with how do we get the right humans in place first, and then use that to then pull in the right technologies and AI and other things. But really making sure we're building from the foundation of investing in things that you would think of as sort of like table stakes type resources in men's sports, but that still like more capital is needed to build out those management teams within women's sports.
For sure, for sure. Obviously, as a female investor in the sports landscape, you're a trailblazer, and probably inspiration to many young women. Do you feel any type of pressure when it comes to that, or is that something that you think about when you're operating in some of these rooms and meeting with some of the people, the top, experts or executives within this ecosystem?
Yeah, it's interesting. I do feel like the sports investment space is definitely more male dominated, but since founding Monarch and operating a lot in the women's sports space, I would say it's like more common that I'm on a Zoom with, 10 tiles that are all women, which is, I
That's
think
amazing.
I wouldn't have believed in my days of sort of generalist sports investing. And so it's fun to see the way a lot of women show up in this space. But, equally, I think like what's important to move women's sports forward is like, everyone playing in this space. And so, bringing a real like diversity of people, including gender and bringing men along, I think is really important as well. But yeah, I mean, I think I was lucky to have a lot of mentors who happened to be male along the way, who really helped me to learn and develop and grow. And it's exciting to see more and more female talent moving into this space as well. So it's exciting. I mean, I think the thing that I feel more pressure around is like, I think probably you'd hear this from a lot of people operating in women's sports right now. It's like there's a lot of enthusiasm and excitement and momentum, and there's a ton of hard work to do to continue to grow and set new records and accelerate this space. And so I think I always feel pressure of like, we need to make anything we invest in a success, not just because we need to drive investor returns for our LPs, which obviously we take really seriously, but it's also like, setting the next proof point to bring more capital in from other sources into women's sports and keep this ecosystem growing. And so, yeah, we take that, you know, commitment and opportunity really seriously.
I love it. What advice would you give to another woman who's looking to get into the sports investment ecosystem?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's real power in bringing like a different type of perspective into the space. And so, whether that's, a woman's perspective as a female consumer and sports fan that's often so underrepresented in the investment decision making space, through to just really leaning into the other ways that, any person coming into the space is really like unique and different. Like what are the things about your lived experience, about the way you think about and see the world that can push people to think differently? Because I think like that's kind of at the end of the day the whole thing in investing. If you just believe the same things that everyone else believes, it's really hard to make money in investing. I think you have to be able to take a different perspective. And so I don't know. I think seeing that like in spaces where there's less representation, like seeing the difference that you bring as the superpower that you bring, I think is potentially powerful.
It's great advice. Last question before we wrap up. Looking 5 to 10 years from now, what would what's the outcome for Monarch? What would you say, this is successful? What would be the thing that says like Monarch has had a successful outcome for you all? And what's one prediction that you have for the women's sports space more broadly?
Yeah. Yeah. When we measure success at Monarch, we really kind of tie it to two main outcomes. So one is definitely investment returns. Like, we believe that this can be and should be, one of the highest performing sports investment funds out there. And so really like, making the investments and delivering value post investment to really make that happen for our investors and for the space overall. But we also think about representation as sort of the other key metric and almost like the leading indicator of that investment success. Back to the topic of innovation, like we're just really big believers in that having a representative base of owners and investors around the table in women's sports and operators, management teams within our portfolio companies leads to that like diversity of thought that drives to innovation and drives to different types of experiences that will sort of continue to set the standard for this industry. And so we feel like if we're not building representative ownership groups or representative management teams, we're not going to drive to those like best in class investment outcomes. And so we really measure both of those things very closely on a quarterly basis and spend a lot of time talking about that with our portfolio companies and with the investors who've backed us as a fund. And so I think, continuing to see those two metrics both move in lockstep is how we feel like we know we have that we're building a healthy fund and can continue to raise more capital and grow the investment that happens into this space. And yeah, I think one prediction for the ecosystem, I think, there's a lot of focus on, all of the growth that we're seeing in US women's sports, but I think you're going to see some, really incredible commercial outcomes starting to happen in markets outside of the US. And so, I think in the next 5 to 10 years, like I feel pretty confident that we're going to find the first billion-dollar team, not only, within the ranks of the NWSL and the WNBA, but I think you're going to see it in football teams in a handful of markets outside of the US as well. And I think that'll be really exciting to see since we've, I think a lot of the commercialization in some other markets has lagged behind. And so I think you're going to see that catch up happen really quickly here.
Couldn't agree more. Jasmine, super appreciative for your time. Lastly, can you let everyone know where they can learn more about Monarch Collective as well as connect with you?
Yeah, absolutely. So our website is Monarch Call, so COLL.com. So definitely visit us there. We also post a lot of information on LinkedIn. So that's another great place to find us. And we're always excited to talk to folks who are passionate about whether women's sports, whether operators or investors or others. So please do reach out.
Thank you so much, Jasmine.
Amazing. Thank you.